Šiandieninė diskusija vyks anglų kalba, tai pradėsim angliškai. Good evening, my name is Marcin Łapczyński, I'm a director of the Polish Institute in Vilnius. I would like to welcome all of you at a discussion called Crimean Crime Consequences for International Law and Politics. The discussion is being organized by the Center for Polish and Russian Understanding and Dialogue, and Vytautas Magnus University, in cooperation with the Polish Embassy, Polish Institute in Vilnius, Lithuanian National Library of Martynas Mažvydas here in Vilnius, and Vilnius Policy Analysis Institute, also in Vilnius. Before starting the discussion, I would like to invite Her Excellency Urszula Doroszewska, Ambassador of the Republic of Poland, to Lithuania for an opening speech.
Honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen, in late February 2014, Russia committed a crime many thought unimaginable for the 21st century. While the world's attention was on the closing of the Winter Olympics in Sochi, soldiers in unmarked green uniforms began to infiltrate Crimean Peninsula. Those green men were sent by the Kremlin with heavy arms in trucks with no numbers, wearing uniforms without insignia, to occupy and annex territory that belongs to sovereign country. By this process, Russia has broken so many international agreements that listing them all is a challenge. To select a few examples, Russia violated upon Article 2 of the United Nations Charter, the Helsinki Final Act, and the Russia-Ukraine Treaty of Friendship. Moreover, the Budapest Memorandum to respect the existing borders of Ukraine and refrain from the threat of use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of Ukraine, and so was broken. Up to these days, Russia added fuel to the fire of conflict in eastern Ukraine. The tragedy of Malaysian airplane and situation of Crimean Tatars should also be listed to show how much Russian aggression influenced Ukraine and the international community. Formally, Ukrainian Crimea was annexed into the Russian Federation on 18 of March 2014. 5 years after that event, we should remind ourselves of the enormity of what happened and redouble our determination to stand up for our values and uphold international law. The security of every nation depends on the essential principle that countries should not change borders or acquire territory by force. That is why the fate of Crimea matters to all of us. I would like to add something very personal. Over 10 years I cooperated with Crimean Tatars, and I'm proud of my friendship with Mustafa Džemilev. I have the utmost respect for this brave nation, which after years of exile and Stalinist repression, returned to their homeland, to Crimea, and was attacked by the enemy again. This is the nation which is so close for us, Poles and Lithuanians, and we should consequently pay international community's attention to its situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. And now I would like to welcome and invite to the stage Mr. Ernest Wyciszkiewicz, who is a director of the Polish-Russian Center for Dialogue and Understanding in Warsaw, which in fact is very unique and interesting institution. And Director Wyciszkiewicz will tell us something more about its activities.
Thank you. Yes, it is a very unique institution. I will just let you know why in a couple of seconds, because we are much more interested in our debate here than that's self-promotion. Nevertheless, the confusion we create is related to the name that we have, and even our Director Łapczyński fell into the trap of this confusion, because he introduced, the second time, he introduced us as Polish-Russian Center for Dialogue and Understanding, which would actually mean that we are a Polish-Russian institution. No, we are not. We are a public entity established 8 years ago in 2011 to foster dialogue between Poles and Russians on many levels. We do a lot of different things. We are very proud of youth exchange program that we created 7 years ago with above 5,000 young people from Poland and Russia visiting each other and doing common projects. We do a lot of publishing. We do a lot of research, scientific research, in cooperation with renowned Polish, Russian, international researchers. We do a lot of seminars, conferences like this in Poland, in other places, and we are very proud that we can be here and very privileged that we have such an excellent partners, without whom it wouldn't be possible for us to organize this event. We provide scholarships for young Russian researchers that are interested in Poland somehow, in Polish-Russian relations. And a lot of meetings, seminars, public debates that we believe are necessary to somehow invest into these very difficult relations right now, because as you all know, we are in a very specific period. And after 2014 and the Russian international crime and aggression against Ukraine, annexation of Crimea, and constant destabilization of situation in Donbass, these conditions are much harsher today. But we believe that dialogue has sense, and we believe that despite the circumstances, there is even more need to do that kind of events. There's a more need to continue honest conversation, dialogue. Not the dialogue that we remember from former times, but there were a lot of association of friendship in our region, Soviet Polish, Soviet Slovak, Soviet Czech associations of friendship, which were supposed just to confirm that everything is okay. No, not everything is okay. There are a lot of difficult issues ahead of us. And Crimea, Ukraine is one of most important of them. That is why right after the annexation, we came up with the idea to organize an international conference with renowned international lawyers from all over the world to analyze the situation and to think about the consequences of this crime for international law, for international politics. We did it 4 years ago in cooperation with Professor Czapliński and the Institute of Law Studies of Polish Academy of Sciences. And here you can see the result of this conference. Last year we published a book, The Case of Crimea's Annexation under International Law, with the papers from a dozen or so international lawyers covering a lot of nitty-gritty details when it comes to the legal and political consequences of this conflict and of annexation. Also with Russian version of the whole story, which might be very interesting for you, because as you know, generally speaking, the whole world has a bit different understanding of what happened legally in Crimea than Russia. Nevertheless, we provided the floor also to our Russian colleagues. And they didn't agree with each other, which was very interesting at that time. They have also debate within their own country about what really happened. So this is what we believe is still important to let people know all over the region, that crime is not Crimea, and the crime that happened there is, even if a thing that politically it's quite difficult to solve today, but nonetheless it will be on the table with us for any time soon, and it will not. And we need to work also jointly to not let this thing be thrown out of the window by those who think that it can be done, because it's still very important, especially for Poland, I believe also for Lithuania, for generally for our region. Thank you for coming here, and let me pass the microphone to the moderator of today's discussion, Dr. Andžej Pukšto. Thank you.
So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Once more, you are welcome on discussion Crimean crime, consequences for the international law and politics. And big pleasure to introduce me for you, Professor Dagmar Richter from University of Saarbrücken. Also, big pleasure to present me Professor Władysław Czapliński from Institute of Political Studies of Polish Academy of Sciences, of Legal Studies, okay, from Polish Academy of Sciences. Also Professor Šarūnas Liekis from Vytauto Magnus University, and Director Ernest Wyciszkiewicz, who introduced himself some minutes before. As director told for us, the pretext of this meeting, of this panel, is publishing of this book, the case of Crimea's annexation under the international law. I know that the presentation of this book took place in Warsaw, in Krakow, also in Kiev and in Odessa, and in Lviv also as well. And these presentations means usually warm welcomes for this research, for this book also. I think from our Lithuanian context, from Vilnius perspective, is also for us as for post-socialist country, is very important, this topic, and all these cases which took place not only in Ukraine but before. I think it's important to underline the events in Georgia, in Tbilisi. I know that Ambassador Urszula Droszewska had worked in Tbilisi, so it's very symbolical that this problem, also in context of international law, after Tbilisi will return, we can say, in Ukraine, but also quite dramatic situation is still now in Moldova with Transnistria. So it's a big packet of problems. So I think this case, the case of Crimea, it's one of several cases which took place on post-Soviet area. So the first question is quite simple, I think. Maybe not primitive, but simple. That is international law is working? Is international law just worked until now? We have United Nations. We have also European organizations, so it's Organization of Stability and Security, which was established in 1975 in Helsinki. It was managed by Madam Ambassador. Also, we have European institutions, we have European Council, at least. So, in general, sometimes I think we are forgetting that we have not only a political dimension, political relations, but also we have international law. So I think it has sense to start from this law dimension at the beginning. So the first, my request is to Dagmar Richter. So what is your perspective? So I think maybe also you little show for us, introduce for us also German perspective. But general question is the first question is international law is working in general? Yeah, of course. Yeah, please, as more comfortable for you. Yeah.
So, ladies and gentlemen, my introductory notes are concerned with the legal status of Crimea and Sevastopol, especially at the time when it acceded to the Russian Federation. Let us go back to the events of March 2014. On the 11th of March, the Ukrainian Autonomous Crimean Republic declared its independence subject to the outcome of a referendum. On the 16th of March, the so-called referendum was held, in which a large majority voted for independence and subsequent accession to Russia. However, the referendum was not coordinated with Ukraine, violated Ukrainian law, did not meet democratic standards, and took place in a situation of military occupation. Just 1 week later, on the 18th of March, the so-called Republic of Crimea applied to join the Russian Federation. On the 21st of March, the Russian Federation ratified the accession treaty. The question then is, has an interim state been created here that was entitled to join Russia? And if not, what would the consequences be? First of all, what actually is a state? According to classical doctrine, a state should fulfill 3 main criteria, namely possession of a territory, a defined territory, a permanent population, and effective government. According to the standards laid down in the so-called Montevideo Convention, a state, in addition, needs to have the capacity to enter into relations with other states. According to this approach, a 4th criterion seems to exist. However, the capacity to enter into relations with other states may also be regarded as being covered by the criterion of effective government. If these criteria, 3 or 4, must be fulfilled, does the existence of a state depend on recognition? And what role does legality play in that context? In theory, and according to traditional doctrine, recognition is only declaratory. That means a state exists when it meets the criteria of statehood. So legality is not part of it. In practice, however, recognition remains relevant. Whilst recognition by fellow states can prove the effectiveness of a given entity's state-like power, non-recognition can render an entity de facto non-existent. If a supposed state is not accepted by all other states, it cannot freely determine its foreign policy and thus lacks external sovereignty. So, a state is a state simply because it exists, but it still needs to prove its existence, mainly by recognition. Now, does a separatist entity, under certain conditions, have the right to become a state on its own and, as in the case of Crimea, join another state, Russia? The answer is no. It is widely accepted in international law that, other than in the context of decolonization or in the context of genocide, no entity has the right to establish an independent state. So regularly, there is no right to secession without the consent of the state concerned, no matter whether the seceding entity fulfills the criteria of statehood. Another question, however, is whether entities can attempt to become independent by just declaring independence. The International Court of Justice, in its advisory opinion on Kosovo, concluded that the mere fact of declaring independence unilaterally does not in itself predetermine illegality, unless illegality results from the violation of particular rules. So you have to look for particular rules. Let us take the case of Crimea. What particular rules of international law could be violated here? The rules that matter here most concern the circumstances of separation and ultimately the legality of the recognition of a new state. Third states, such as Russia, cannot freely decide whether to recognize a separatist entity as a state. Rather, they have to respect the rights of the state concerned. Ukraine, which is the state concerned, has a basic right to territorial integrity. This right will be infringed if the territory being split off is prematurely recognized as a new state. The prohibition of premature recognition intervenes if the new regime is recognized as independent, even though it has not yet established effective government. By concluding an accession treaty with the Crimean regime in March 2014, the Russian Federation has conclusively recognized Crimea, which was premature in view of Crimea's situation. So the principle of non-intervention was clearly violated. But even if the separatist entity had succeeded in stabilizing its rule, its recognition may be prohibited by international law. This is in particular the case if the separation takes place in a situation involving the use of force. The prohibition of the threat or use of force is not only enshrined in the UN Charter, as the ambassador has mentioned before, but also constitutes a peremptory norm of general international law. As we can see from the General Assembly resolution on the definition of aggression, as well as from the International Court of Justice jurisprudence, the prohibition of the use of force covers not only the invasion of troops, but also the sending and supporting of armed groups, irregular groups, which carry out acts of force. And furthermore, it covers the use of armed forces of one state, which are within another state, with the agreement of that state, but in contravention of the conditions provided for in the agreement. In our case, aggression in that case, in that sense, was engaged especially by the Black Sea Fleet, by camouflage fighters, and so on. Is there any justification for it? Russia has indeed put forward a number of reasons for the inclusion of Crimea and Sevastopol in the Federation. For example, invitation by the Ukrainian President Yanukovych, invitation by the Crimean separatist institutions, humanitarian intervention, responsibility to protect Russia's alleged historic right to reunification, the right of self-determination, similarity to the Kosovo case, or simply the need of interpreting international law more practical and more flexible. Without going into the details, which can be discussed later, none of these arguments justifies the use of force to finally annex parts of the Ukrainian territory. That there has been a serious breach of a peremptory norm of international law is also confirmed by the conclusions of the European Union Foreign Affairs Council, which stated, I quote, "The European Union strongly condemns the clear violation of Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity by acts of aggression by the Russian armed forces, as well as the authorization given by the Federation Council of Russia. These actions are in clear breach of the United Nations Charter and the OSCE Helsinki Final Act, as well as of Russia's specific commitments. This was endorsed by the heads of state of government of the European Union, and this is also the German position, so there's no difference to mention. Many other actors. While the Security Council was, of course, blocked by Russian veto, the United Nations General Assembly by 100 votes, adopted a resolution on the territorial integrity of Ukraine. In this resolution, the General Assembly called upon all states and international institutions, I quote, not to recognize any alteration of the status of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol on the basis of the referendum, and to refrain from any action or dealing that might be interpreted as recognizing any such altered status. Given that Russia has violated the prohibition of the use of force, what are the legal consequences? According to the General Assembly's Friendly Relations Declaration, no territorial acquisition resulting from the threat or use of force shall be recognized as legal. Similarly, the International Law Commission's draft articles on responsibility of states. However, the International Court of Justice, in its Namibia advisory opinion, it's quite old, it's from 1971, has clarified that there are some exceptions to the obligation not to recognize. The relevant passage reads, I quote, while official acts are illegal and invalid, the invalidity cannot be extended to those acts, such as, for instance, the registration of birth, death, and marriages, the effects of which cannot be ignored only to the detriment of the inhabitants of the territory. So it's not quite clear what, for instance, means, but there are some exceptions in favor of individuals. So what does the obligation not to recognize mean, despite of possible exceptions? I will only mention 2 examples. There are many more of it. For example, first, trade preferences remain applicable, but certification of origin by the new local authorities will not be accepted. Secondly, second example, citizens retain citizenship of the old state, which is Ukraine. Passports issued by the new state will not be recognized. Residents of Crimea and Sevastopol can obtain Schengen visas only at consulates located in Ukraine. So this is quite practical, what international law is like. In the case of Crimea, the European Union has also adopted a couple of sanctions, including restrictions on economic relations, asset freezes, and travel restrictions, etc. So collective countermeasures are taken to increase the effects of non-recognition. But now there is still a logical problem to solve. If the recognition of states in international law is only declaratory, what sense does the non-recognition of entities make then? As we can see, there is a tendency, a very new tendency in international law to regard the non-recognition of a new entity as constitutive if there is a violation of the use of force. Even, and this is important, even if the entity fulfills the criteria of statehood. For example, the EU, Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on the conflict in Georgia, you mentioned it before, in its report of 2009 has distinguished, this was the start of this new approach, has distinguished 3 different categories of territorial entities which exist on the world. First, full states fulfilling the relevant criteria of statehood and being universally recognized. This is the normal case, of course. Secondly, state-like entities fulfilling the relevant criteria of statehood, but which are not or not universally recognized. This is the interesting case. This is about illegality and non-recognition. And thirdly, entities short of statehood, not fulfilling the criteria, but eventually recognized by one or more states. So this is the crazy case involving premature recognition. Regarding the case of Crimea, it seems apparent that this entity never fulfilled the requirements of effective statement. Crimea thus represented an entity short of statehood, which never possessed of a capacity to accede to the Russian Federation. Hence, accession to the Russian Federation has never been validly declared. Even if the Crimean population had a right to self-determination, it could have claimed autonomy rights, but no right to secession. I come to my conclusion, the last chapter. What are the prospects for the future? Well, recognition of the integration of Crimea into the Russian Federation would assist Russia in maintaining a situation created by a serious breach of international law. Accordingly, the legal obligation not to recognize the results continues to apply. Crimea is not the only case of this kind. We have heard of Georgia, of Transnistria, Nagorno-Karabakh, relating to Georgia, South Ossetia, and Abkhazia, where the same rule applies. In all these cases, cold conflicts have arisen that cement the situation. A situation in which recognition as a new state or part of a new state is not allowed, but original belonging can no longer be realized. This is the cold conflict. This situation is costly for the infringer state, on whom the newly created entities depend. It is important and promising to comply with the non-recognition obligation in order to curb future violations of the prohibition of the use of force. On the other hand, individuals living in Crimea need more than recognition of their birth certificates. This was the exception I mentioned. Is the obligation not to recognize any alteration of the status of Crimea expressive of an outdated understanding of international law that formalistically ignores the status of individuals, respectively of human rights? I don't think so. It's a difficult question, and I will refer that to discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
So, thank you a lot for Professor Dagmar Richter, and now it's time for Professor Władysław Czapliński from Legal Studies Institute of Polish Science Academy. So, Professor, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, both for this invitation and an opportunity to speak here about international law. My problem is that Professor Richter has already reported about everything. So I'm really, in a way, in some trouble. But nonetheless, I would like to put some important questions, questions which seem to me at least very important. When a famous American writer, Mark Twain, one day read a newspaper, and there was an information, this newspaper reporting that our famous writer died some days before. And of course, that was a very sad message for the whole nation, but it was not right. So Mark Twain sent a letter to the editor, publisher of this newspaper, saying informations about the death of Mark Twain are exaggerated and premature. And I would like to start with the message that any information or attempts to declare international law dead are premature. I suppose international law is doing quite well, even if there are some exceptions. You can imagine when we refer to domestic legal order, there are many cases of murder. Every week, every month, every year, a lot of crimes of murder are committed. And no one attempts to modify, to amend the criminal code in order to abolish the crime of murder. So committing a crime does not make law dead. This is I suppose this is an important starting point. Second message, which I would like to disseminate here, is a question: can the state commit a crime? Yeah. You can see it here, crime of Crimea. So what about the crime of states? This is a very difficult question, because in the mid-70s, when the International Law Commission started its codification work on state responsibility, one of the proposals on articles on state responsibility was the cases of crimes of states. And this proposal was opposed by a number of states, quite a numerous number of states, who said, no, the state cannot commit a crime. A crime is a notion of criminal law, domestic law. There is no criminal responsibility of states. Why not? Because there is no enforcement mechanism. Because the states cannot be punished. That's first argument. By the way, nowadays we know that there are cases of criminal responsibility of corporations, and the state is a kind of corporation. But anyway, the rule is that there is no criminal responsibility of state. Another argument, why not? Because all states are equal. And there is a famous Roman saying, par in parem non habet imperium. An equal subject cannot exercise jurisdiction or criminal jurisdiction with respect to other subjects equal to him. This is clear. So the state responsibility, which we're referring here, is totally different than criminal responsibility. This is very important to remember. Then another question, we discussed some issues on during lunch, and one of the arguments was, question posed was, is there any court where the responsibility of the Russian Federation for having committed this crime of Crimea could be enforced? And the answer is no. Because contrary to domestic law, the jurisdiction of international courts depend actually upon the consent of the state concerned. So, and if we look at the history, there were some attempts to make Russian Federation responsible before an International Court of Justice. There was an attempt by Georgia after the war in 2008, and now the attempt by Ukraine because of the conflict in Donbass. Russian Federation is lawyers of the Russian Federation are quite smart. I have to admit it, even if I don't like this statement. I would like to get it contrary, but they are really very good lawyers. They prevented Russia to accept any judicial clause which could subject the Russian Federation to the jurisdiction of international courts. And we can only say, of course, that means that the international legal system is not very efficient, that it's not open to everyone on the same scale and the same way, but this is the fact. We cannot force a state to appear before the international court. This makes the perspective of the Crimean and Ukrainian conflict very difficult. What can be done in such a situation? Well, we have two possible options. First, the Russian Federation decides to cooperate with the international community. We cannot foresee the form of this, neither the form of this cooperation nor the conditions, but generally cooperation is possible. So I could, even if I cannot imagine the situation that the Russian Federation leaves the Crimea, they invested a lot of money and energy in keeping, not to say an international position of Russia, to keep Crimea. So I suppose this is not very probable. But it would be the easiest way to resolve the conflict. Another possibility would be to establish international administration of Crimea. This is a very tricky institution of international law, which is not applied very often. It's happened several times only in the history, but it is possible. So then the international body, international organization, takes over all the tasks of the state in the disputable territory. So there might be an organization which could take over the power in the Crimea without deciding about the sovereignty. We leave the question of sovereignty aside. We just introduce an agency or an organ which would be able to administer, to manage the territory. However, there is one important condition. Ukraine has to repeat its claims to sovereignty in the territory, to the territory of Crimea. This is a role of the protest in international law. You certainly know the statement by Cato, who used to finish every meeting of the Senate in Rome with the famous statements, "I believe Cartagena should be destroyed." At every meeting. So that's what Ukraine should do at every opportunity. We still believe Crimea is Ukrainian. That would be a reason for another possible solution, namely a division, separation between state sovereignty and territorial power or powers with respect to the territory. We could say sovereignty is Ukrainian, power in the territory, Russian. I could not exclude that depending upon the political development. Second option, the Russian Federation does not cooperate with the international community. Now we speak about international responsibility. There are two premises of international responsibility of the state. First, an internationally wrongful act, so the violation of international obligation by the state, which is clear in the case of Crimea. Second, attribution of this violation to the state, which is also clear, even with the little green man, which occurred to be soldiers fighting, Russian soldiers fighting without distinctions. What are the consequences of internationally wrongful act? There are three according to international law. First is an immediate cessation of the wrongful act. So we have to repeat at every opportunity, Russia must go home from Crimea. Crimea remains Ukrainian. Second element, factor, is to guarantee that there won't be similar solutions in future. This is a question of confidence. And I don't think the international community has that much confidence towards some states. But this is the rule. And third element is a reparation in a very large sense. As long as Russia does not start to cooperate, there is still an obligation not to recognize the consequences of the wrongful act, which were already reported. So if I have to propose some conclusions, international community has several possibilities to react to what's going on in Crimea. The scope of this action, the steps to be undertaken, and so on, depend absolutely on the political will of the states and the international community. I leave the question open. Lawyers are not ready to propose solutions. We can analyze the situation. We can check its conformity or non-conformity with international law, but that's for the politicians to elaborate solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. So I can joke only that after lawyers, there is nothing to do for political sciences usually. But in any case, I would like to ask Director Wyciszkiewicz about the general situation about, or maybe Šarūnas is the first. Okay, Šarūnas, maybe, so you maybe tell us how it's political atmosphere around the Crimea question in this moment in Europe and in the world in general. So, because on one hand, it still seems that more or less world and Europe also recognize this situation, and there are some efforts, maybe we don't see all of them, but more or less political world, political leaders in some places tolerated this situation. So what is your view? What is your analysis through Europe, but also from global perspective?
Okay, so I would like to start probably from a very basic, let's say, assessment of the present situation, which is very much would stress the difference of our times, though not in terms of great changes in the legal system, international legal system, but in terms of priorities. I think the world of geopolitics is going a little bit away from and is being surpassed by the world of geoeconomics. And geoeconomics, kind of very practical, let's say, expectations, infrastructure issues, very often are taking over values, principles of enlightenment in which we were all educated, at least those who were born in the 20th century. So those who were born in the 20th century, they were believing, they had basically a trust and belief in a world which is getting better, the world which is based on justice and naturally then on the law, on the strong basis, legal basis. And right now, with the recent developments, when we see in the world of, in contemporary world, new powers emerging in Asia, the Russian factor from 2000, approximately 2000, influencing East Central European situation very much. So everywhere we see that very often our values and at the same time laws and trust in law is somehow shaken by different value systems. And very often I understand that, for example, like in human rights issues, I mean, the rights very often are being somehow supplemented and surpassed by the values, and this is wrong in principle, I mean, in the world, for example, in the context of the Council of Europe. But overall, we hear the claims for the specific value systems, for peculiar value systems, which basically can be in denial of international law. And, the history is very, let's say, colorful, and in many situations, let's say, the priority for the status quo, to preserve status quo, to preserve the system based on the law depends on the, let's say, power balance. I mean, just shortly to mention to everybody that, for example, the conventions on aggression and the very, let's say, concept of aggression was first proposed and developed basically by the Soviet lawyers. I mean, everybody would smile, but in 1933, so-called London's conference on, this was a conference on economic development, but basically then the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Litvinov, managed basically to push the Soviet concept of aggression into an international agenda. But basically then the Soviet interest was to preserve and to in a sense, conserve the status quo in Europe after the period of bilateral peace treaties between then Soviet Russia and then Soviet Union with the neighboring countries, starting like from Afghanistan, Lithuania, for example, Poland, Yugoslavia, Romania, Turkey, etc., etc. So then basically the Soviet, and actually they signed this agreement with Lithuania as well. And Lithuanian argument to sign this kind of agreement on non-aggression with the Soviets was very simple. The Soviets didn't have any territorial claims to Lithuania. This was the thinking. I mean, that they don't have territorial claims. Then they thought, the Soviets and the Russians are very different from the Poles, who had, Vilna then, Vilnius area. And so the Soviets were completely seen in different light. However, they didn't calculate that, you can lose everything, not only piece of territory, but you can lose everything you have. So they didn't think about this. And this is the whole story behind, and then for example, for Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania in 1933, this was a kind of surprise why Prime Minister ordered, to sign this pact of non-aggression with a separate pact of non-aggression with the Soviet Union, while the others signed collective pacts of non-aggression. And this is the whole story. I mean, if somebody is interested, I can tell afterwards. But so I want to finish a little bit, with kind of a little bit of element of skepticism, because actually I think this kind of balance of power and the realities of geoeconomics right now are influencing, in a sense, the way we try to preserve our values of enlightenment and the values of and trust in law. Thank you.
So, Dr. Ernest Wyciszkiewicz, maybe you present some more optimistic perspective of returning Crimea to Ukraine. On another hand, we need to remind that 10 years passed after Russian aggression in Georgia, and the world, also Europe, didn't find any solution how to return South Ossetia and Abkhazia to Georgia. So how many time will we need to solve this Crimea crisis? So do you have some optimistic views in this case?
If you propose a measure such as Russians going back to the mainland and letting Crimea go to Ukraine again as a sort of criteria to assess optimism, then no, I'm not that optimistic, because politically it's, of course, right now very difficult to imagine. But this is not the way how we should assess international law as such. I mean, as Professor Czapliński mentioned, the Crimea crime is not the last crime that great power will commit in world history. There will be more. And to follow up to what Šarūnas mentioned, that geoeconomics is replacing geopolitics in this traditional sense, it also will create problems and tensions, and the emerging powers will try for sure to check the sustainability of our international law structure, and will try to push it further and to check if it works or not for their own interest. So no, it's not. But this is not the way how we should assess, I think, the way whether international law works or not. This is the same question that I have problem with when someone asks the question related to more specific issue today, whether the sanctions work or not. And people tell, well, since Russia is still in Crimea and they are still in Donbass and they do not do anything to change their policies, it means sanctions do not work, which is a nonsense, total nonsense. Nonetheless, this is sort of the way how sometimes people perceive that kind of political and legal instruments put on the table, while they have different objectives, different goals. The general question is that I think that international law matters regardless of the fact that great power, this or another, from time to time violates it, because it's inevitable in a way. It will be happening. What we can do, and what international lawyers can do, and what other states can do, like Poland, like Lithuania, let's say small and mid-sized countries, it is to make that kind of adventures more and more expensive politically. So to make great powers think twice. So in order when they will start thinking about doing something against the rules. And if you look, for instance, at the intensity of Russian actions to justify, well, first to make Crimea legal, but when it quickly turned out that it's impossible to make Crimea annexation legal, so they start to think how to make it legitimate. They started to invoke historical rights. They start to present, to try to create sort of the social recognition that, okay, we committed the crime, but you know, it was justified. It was a just crime. I mean, the intensity and the efforts that Russian Federation has been doing since 2014 to convince Russians, their own society, that what they did actually was somehow in compliance with international law. Because when you are listening to Sergei Lavrov today, he will still be claiming that this was all legal. And it's the message to the Russian audience. Russians, well, there is this hype, Kremnash, still on the table, but they would like to think about themselves as someone who actually is in compliance with general rules that are all over the place. So it shows that even authoritarian regimes, even great powers, need to do a lot of efforts to decrease the costs of the political adventures that are against the law. So it's not that's why I'm optimistic in a way. So this is something that I believe it is a process. It's not gonna happen overnight, and we will be doing 2 steps forward, 1 step back. The decision of Donald Trump to recognize Golan Heights is 1 step back, actually. It's very much related to actually what happened to Crimea, and it will be used by Russian propaganda to prove that what happened in Crimea is sort of the normal thing. Great powers do that kind of thing from time to time. And I had, right after Crimea, I remember I participated in the conference in Warsaw where some eminent Russian researchers were present at the time, and there was a very tense atmosphere, but at that time it was very close to this annexation time. It was April 2014, and they were claiming with some happy faces that, well, it's just an episode. Well, it happens sometimes, and but let's just forget about it. Let's get back to what we have been doing in the last 10 years. Just it happens. Kosovo happened, Iraq happened, so Crimea happened, and well, from time to time we have this kind of episodes of great powers doing a little bit more than we would like them to do. But this is something that actually has been happening, I think, all over the world. That my own impression, I'm not a lawyer, my own impression is that generally states observe international law. Not because all of them believe that international, because of to get some better moral position, because they are altruistic, because they want to be more civilized. No, because the costs of in compliance with the law are higher and higher. And the institutions, international institutions, international law actually make more and more difficult to cheat on the international stage. You need to put a lot of efforts to achieve your objectives. So sometimes countries simply think that, well, it's not worthy to go against the law. It's better to find another way, to find a compromise, to look for political solutions, or to look for real legitimate solutions. So this is why I think that, generally speaking, if you look at the literature, for instance, on international law and in political science, you have thousands of volumes about war. You have the whole war studies, hundreds, thousands. And if you were coming from another planet, I believe that someone who would just look at the library would have thought that the history of humankind is the history of constant warfare. Constant. But if we look at the history, then, well, it doesn't work this way. I mean, we have a lot of times and periods of time with a peaceful cooperation between states, which is not that very often present in literature. There are not many books about trying to analyze why states cooperate, why states comply with the law, why states obey and observe the law. There are some, but for the general public, I mean, the message is sent that, generally speaking, we are in a state of war all of the time, which is false, actually, which is false. And the last thing is that very practical from the perspective of countries like Poland, like Lithuania, and many others, in the world that for which actually international law is the only available shield against actions of countries like Russia and others. We can think about alliances, we can think about international organizations. Yes, they are very beneficial for us, because we wouldn't be able to do a lot of things that we do within these organizations alone. But when it comes to international law, it provides us with a structure, certain structure that we should stick to it, and we should think as one of the most significant things to ensure our survival and existence, let alone the development. So that is why, if I understand the researchers in Russia, in United States, in China, that try to be a bit more cynical when it comes to international law. They treat it from the position of great power as a sort of rather an instrument, just a sort of reflection of distribution of power. So yes, we think it's important, but when it becomes against our interests and we do what we want to do, I understand those researchers, I understand those intellectuals, because it complies with the sort of position of their state. But if the scholars or researchers from countries like Poland and Lithuania and other small countries try to undermine actually the international law as a practical, very practical instrument to defend ourselves and to ensure development, then I feel that we are going in the wrong direction, because this is very practical. International law is not that theoretical as it seems for many people that are just listening to the lawyers, all those terms, definitions. That's very difficult, very complex, thinking that it doesn't have any impact on our lives. In my opinion, it has, and it will have even more in the future. Thank you.
So thank you, Director, a lot. And now is really time for questions, for remarks from the hall. So if there are some questions, it's really welcome. So please introduce yourself.
Hi, thank you for your presentations. My name is Denis Parkhaev. I'm the senior associate at Mateko Zavchis, which is a law firm just across the road, which makes it convenient to come here. I'm doing my PhD research at Queen Mary University of London on the Crimean events, but from the perspective of the investment arbitration. My question to you would be a tricky one. It would be on the survival of international treaties in the seceded areas. Now, the underlying rationale would be that if you annex a territory, you should observe the standards that were there before you took it. Because if you effectively control the territory, you have to ensure the rule of law. Now, having that in mind, can you sue Russia under an international treaty which Russia did not sign, but which was effective there because Ukraine signed it prior to secession? So that would be my question to you.
So maybe Professor Dagmar Richter or Professor Czapliński will answer.
Yeah. I would say very briefly, no. If I have to justify my position, Russia is not party to that treaty, and we still, if we apply treaties, we have to check whether both parties to the disputes are also parties to the specific treaty. But I know that this is a huge problem in international arbitration, and there is a lot of cases which are brought against Russian Federation, Ukraine. This is unclear. Yeah? I can imagine the situation where there were both Ukraine and Russian Federation are parties to the specific treaty, and there is a dispute concerning Crimea, and then instead of showing Ukraine, another subject shows the Russian Federation. That's the case of the European Convention on Human Rights. But in the investment arbitration and the investment treaties, I'm afraid the situation is different.
Yeah. So he's absolutely right, I'm sorry to say, but just in a theoretical perspective, it is actually discussed by them, very theoretical-minded scholars, whether there is a general duty not to damage others as a rule existing in international law. We know that especially from environmental law, but it is not yet acknowledged in the field of investment law. Of course, you could try to refer to the principles of the United Nations, which have been ratified by Russia as well as other parties, to respect international rules and many other principles. And you can try to draw from that general obligation of the kind I mentioned before, but this is not yet acknowledged. You can try it.
It would be rather a claim to reparate. It would be the claim to reparate damages, but not a direct claim based on the investment treaty.
So some more questions, remarks, or yes.
Virginia Budienė, Vilnius Institute for Policy Analysis. I have a very sensitive question. In Estonia, Narva region is under the question. Latgalia with Daugavpils in Latvia is under the question. If we are thinking about bigger countries neighboring and minorities living there. In Macedonia, there is an area where Albanians live very compactly, and also there are other countries where we have very compactly living minorities. In Crimea, there were Russian, let's say, minority who was not resisting, doing referendum, everything was okay. Do you think that assimilation of minorities or economic strengthening and introducing more titular nation in those regions would be the prevention?
I think it's more political maybe question than maybe for Director Wyciszkiewicz, so for you.
Obviously, the Russian Federation, since the very beginning of the 90s, used this minority card in foreign policy for different times for different reasons. Sometimes it was purely instrumentalized. Of course, but there is a big question about how the local population perceives themselves as a part of the society they live in, whether they feel assimilated enough or not, whether they feel supported or not. But this is this is important. I mean, the more we invest, I mean, the countries that you mentioned invest in those minorities and try to protect them from that kind of third-party intrusions, the better. But as Crimea case shows something different. I mean, Russians instrumentalized the whole thing totally. I mean, it didn't matter. I mean, the whole referendum thing, the whole justification afterwards that there was some intimidation of the local Russian population, that there was no Russian language schools whatsoever. All of that was fake. It was invented just for this political act of aggression. And so, if there is a will to instrumentalize those sensitive relations between some minorities and the rest of the country, yes, it could help countries like Russia to add some fuel. But this is not the main point, I think. I mean, Russian policy showed that you can easily build upon non-existent even resentments. You can create them just for the public relations purposes. But we don't have that kind of problem in Poland, but in Lithuania, maybe Šarūnas would disagree.
I mean, dealing with the minority issues, I mean, politically, there are many strategies, I mean, the states employ. I mean, it's like we mentioned a few, like assimilation, acculturation. There are kind of intermediary strategies. And I think, it's let's say, very much everything depends on the context. I mean, there is no one universal advice, what to do and how to do. And because even, for example, I want to connect this question a little bit with the question of arbitration. For example, the Tsarist Empire, after, let's say, after they took the whole Rzeczpospolita, okay? Not the whole, I mean, part of the Rzeczpospolita, so they basically preserved, for example, let's say, parts of the former Grand Duchy of Lithuania, they preserved basically the privileges and rights of, at least of the nobility, and basically they left the system as the system existed before. So basically, nobility preserved everything, the legal system didn't change, the material rights, public law. Basically, apart from the monarch, which is sitting, St. Petersburg, didn't change much on the ground. I mean, okay, recruits, but I mean, it's like the whole system, I mean, didn't touch more than 1% probably of the population, like recruits, going to the Tsarist imperial army. And still they were not successful because basically there was a moment, there was an uprising in the Duchy of Warsaw, Kingdom of Poland, and then, basically we have the problem that basically the local nobility is trying to defend their own rights and basically to get out of, the imperial tutelage. So, and then the Russian argument was then, okay, we have a problem because actually they have these rights and because of that they are not loyal to the country, so we should abolish all the system. So basically after the November uprising of 1930-31. So basically we have a situation on in 1835, they abolish all the privileges and basically they somehow, the way they understood then, I mean, tried, to incorporate the whole, all the country, let's say, or parts of the former Grand Duchy and Polish Rzeczpospolita, into the Russian Empire. So, and still, with this modern nationalism, the process cannot be controlled and manipulated to 100%. In the time of illiteracy, when you were able to do it, like even in Lithuania, into a period. I mean, it's like we know that, for example, okay, we from Vytauto University with Andžej, so and. Around Kaunas, majority of the people were speaking, Polish. I mean, let's say Rumšiškės or whatever. Right now we would say, this is Rumšiškės, it's a Lithuanian place, it's folklore museum, etc. 100%. I mean, in the census of 1923, you have 100% people speaking Polish. But then, I mean, it's like in the time of illiteracy, when everybody is illiterate, I mean, through literacy and basically through giving, primary education, you can, easily turn people into what you want, basically. This was the time when it was possible to do. Right now, it's much more complicated because basically we have, internet. You can become.
Which is very dangerous.
It's very dangerous at the same time. Yeah, I completely agree with the professor. And basically, you have a choice right now. So you have to be motivated for this. You cannot be forced to do this. In a sense, you have to use the situation of freedom and, to be free to choose what you like. Technically, you can become whoever you want. I mean, in the age of globalization. Right now, I mean, any of you can say, I'm fed up of being Roman Catholic. I want to become what? Sikh in India. Technically it's possible. I mean, you get in touch with your friends in California where you have Native American Sikhs, white Native Americans, and you can become. I mean, you have a freedom of choice. And this kind of territorial state is not able anymore to impose with the same rigidity as they were doing it in an interwar period. I mean, it's like all this assimilation of minorities, let be in Polish Republic or Lithuanian Republic in interwar period, was much more successful because people didn't have any option, to choose from. They were, going into the local primary school, and during the census, they would say, it's like, I saw some documents from Lithuania, the same was in Poland. I mean, aš užrašau tave lietuviu, man nesvarbu, kaip tu čia kalbėjai, ne? So I don't care the language you speak. I mean, I write you as a Lithuanian, I'm finished. So, you don't know to write and to read in different language, and you're stuck, so it's... So what I want to say that many things depend on the context. I mean, it's because of that, I think there is a validity and reasoning for political sciences. Usually, very often, I mean, it's like, well, these bullshit masters, they're just talking, they don't give anything practical. But in a sense of political science, I think they have added value in understanding context and helping to tackle difficult situations. So this is my intervention.
So, some other questions, remarks, suggestions, I don't know. Yeah. We have some questions, no? Okay, yeah, we have.
I'm sorry, I would like to try to ask you. My question is, let's imagine that someone else in the world decide to annex something else, any other territory. It's not Russia, it's a country without veto in United Nations. So in this case, is world community have something else besides sanctions to punish this country or not?
So I think it's a clear question, yeah?
Yeah, maybe I can start and he will continue. Of course, it really depends on on which state has violated international law, because you certainly know about the veto powers in the Security Council. And this is absolutely vital. This is the essential question. If a state violates international law, which has no veto power in the Security Council has the competence to decide on robust measures, including the use of force. Of course, in many cases, this is prevented by disputes among the big powers, but it can work, and in some cases, it did work.
Just a short comment. In 1992, I had an opportunity to work just for some time at the library of the International Court of Justice in The Hague. And on the building, just opposite the court, there was a huge inscription. What if the main exportation product of Kuwait were broccoli? Yeah? No one would care about annexation of Kuwait. But that was not broccoli, but oil.
Yeah.
I would like to ask about more philosophical question, to transform your question. Do we know, what can we say about countries that actually decided to not, let's say, metaphorically annex anyone, due to international law constraints or political constraints. Do we know any case of that kind of country? No, we don't, because no one will admit it, that he didn't do something or anything because of feeling that it would cost too much. So we usually analyze the political reality based upon what we see, what we can see, and it's absolutely normal. But there are a lot of things that we cannot see. The way how decisions are made, especially in authoritarian regimes, the way how the political calculations are made in those countries. There is a whole area of research that it's very difficult to make more practical to the audience, which is related to what-if question, counterfactual analysis. For many people, it seems absurd, but I can assure that there are a lot of very smart people in the world thinking this way and trying to find a way how can we rationally or how can we methodologically analyze situations that we cannot see, we didn't see, but we could somehow imagine what would the country do if there was no certain conditions. So the question is, what if there were no sanctions imposed in 2014? What would have happened with Russian offensive into Ukraine, to Mariupol and other places? I cannot know. I don't know. We can speculate, but we cannot dismiss this question. So we can only say that, well, Russians didn't leave Crimea because of sanctions. Yes, they didn't. But we don't know what kind of effect sanctions had that Russians will never admit. We would need to have the access to, direct Kremlin access, and to know what those guys are talking about, how they think about future policy actions, how they, in personal exchanges, analyze sanctions, and so on and so forth. So it's very difficult. It's speculation, but I think that we should have this in mind when we think about sanctions and general international law as some sort of instrument of prevention, actually.
So I think that I slowly will close this debate. So because there is not easy questions, not easy answers. Topic it's really serious, and also perspectives are not so very clear. I only would like to remind that this team is also published a book, The Case of Crimea's Annexation and the International Law, and I think that some copies of these books will left here in Martynas Mažvydas National Library. So I would like to say big thanks for Center for Polish-Russian Dialogue and Understanding in Warsaw for this beautiful initiative. Thank you for coming. Thank you also for Polish Institute in Vilnius for supporting, for Embassy of Republic of Poland in Vilnius for supporting, also, of course, for Martynas Mažvydas National Library, and also for our discutants, for our guests. Once more, I would like to thank for Dagmar Richter, also for Professor Władysław Czapliński from Institute of Law Studies of Polish Academy of Sciences, for Professor Šarūnas Liekis from Vytautas Magnus University, and of course for Director Ernest Wyciszkiewicz, who was spiritus movens, I can say, of this initiative, and I hope it's not our last meeting in Vilnius, and you're always welcome. I hope also National Library will open floor for such difficult, not easy discussions. Thank a lot. Thank for all of you.